webinar on creating pathways for community leadership. I am Rhonda Alexander with Vital Village Networks and am so happy to have you here. So as we get started, I just want to share a brief outline of what we'll do today. Welcoming you all, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about Vital Village, and then we'll have our discussion with panelists and follow up with questions and discussion. We have partnered with the Community Language Cooperative based in Denver, Colorado to make today's webinar more language inclusive. So to ensure that you're able to hear today's discussion, please click the globe icon as you can see on your screen and select the language that works best for you. So please select English or Spanish so that you're able to hear and participate fully. A little bit of just an additional note on housekeeping. We will be recording today's session and the slides and the recording will be posted on our Now forum at www.networksofopportunity.org. While we are in a webinar setting, I will invite you to mute your camera and mute your microphones when not speaking. And you can submit questions via the dashboard, and you can use the chat box for comments to share with us throughout today's discussion. Again, here's just a quick outline of how you can submit questions. You can also see the interpretation icon. Be sure to select English or Spanish, and you can also submit questions and add to the chat box there. So just to share a little bit more about Vital Village Networks, we are a network that's committed to maximizing child, family, and community well-being. This work started focusing on 3 neighborhoods in Boston in 2010 and has really been working to improve capacity building and partnerships between residents and organizations. Out of that work has grown the Networks of Opportunity for Child Wellbeing, which is a national initiative powered by Vital Village Networks and focuses on improving the capacity of local communities and coalitions to advance health and educational equity for children, families, and communities. And if you're really interested in continuing to connect with us, please be sure to visit our Now Innovation Forum, which is a national network of peer learning communities, really an opportunity for communities and leaders to share and promote the work that they're doing across the country, focused on preventing early childhood in first cities. And here's again how you can reach us on the Now Innovation Forum. So we hope to see you there. Articles, links to podcasts, webinar recordings are all able to be found there, as well as a plethora of tools and resources. Also want to do a quick reminder and share our podcast In the Arena with Now. Our latest episode is a conversation with Brazelton Touchpoint Center, focused on honoring the strengths and expertise of children and caregivers. So you can find that podcast anywhere you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, etc. So we hope that you're able to take a listen to us and subscribe. So without further ado, I'd like to get us started. Today we have the pleasure of hearing from Allentza Michel, the founder of Powerful Pathways, and we'll also hear from Ishimaru, an associate professor of education at the University of Washington and co-principal investigator of the Family Leadership Design Collaborative. Unfortunately, Regina Elmi is not able to join us today, but I'm sure we will hear more about her work from our conversation with Anne. And so I am going to get us started. I am going to invite Allentza to spend about 5 minutes. If you can just introduce yourself and how you got started in this work and give us an introduction of the work that you do and why co-design is an important part of your work.
Thank you, Rhonda. Hi, everyone. As Rhonda said, my name is Allentza Michel, and I'm the founder of Powerful Pathways. And Powerful Pathways is a planning, policy, and creative consultancy and social practice meaning we do a lot of work around community planning and community development, and we use creative methods such as design thinking, the arts, and creative technology to facilitate our social change work. And I started Powerful Pathways after having a conversation with friends, and we were feeling like we wanted to do more community-based centered work that was co-led and more participatory, and we felt a little constrained to do that within our existing day jobs. So we wanted to create a space to do community-based projects that really centered community empowerment and focused on social equity. And the way we look at social equity is we bring those who are most marginalized to the center. So if we're working in a community or working on a project that is for community, then we work with community to execute that project. For example, we're currently doing a gentrification mapping project where we are engaging in research where we're tracking displacement indicators in the neighborhood. And rather than to do that externally, where we're just coming in and doing some somewhat detached research, we're working really closely with the local neighborhood council and their steering committee to really drive the questions that we're asking. We are training them to be facilitators and to assist us with the field work on the ground. And we're also paying them to do it because part of the work of doing really core equity work is compensating people for their time. So we're taking a very unique approach to this work. And that's just an example of what we do in Powerful Pathways. But what led me down this path to this work is that I was born and raised in Boston and historically underserved communities. And after working as a community organizer, and I spent many years doing parent organizing, working with young people, doing broad-based community organizing on social policy issues such as access to jobs, issues around air quality, and other aspects of public health and social justice issues relative to transportation access, housing, community and economic development of various types. And one of the things that I was often concerned about during my organizing was just how often I would be in rooms with decision makers and community members would be on the table, but not at the table. Meaning they were the focus of conversation, but there were no communities in the room who can speak for themselves, who can speak to the nuanced issues that they were facing. So that eventually, when I started Powerful Pathways, I wanted to do something different. I wanted to make sure that residents were really driving their own destiny, that it wasn't this sort of decision makers are here, community members are here, and somewhere here there's some, loose conversation, but to really bring those parties together and to recognize the power that community members have, then the institutional memory that they bring to the table. So we've been doing a lot of work that really centers on that, and it really builds on some of the principles of the community organizing that I've done, that I've worked with partners, that I've worked with various institutional leaders who understand the value of the grassroots and bring that up to the grass tops. And it's one of those approaches that for a long time wasn't really the most valued approach. But as we've seen in recent years, as we've seen in particularly this year with the pandemic and the disparate impact that the COVID-19 has had on Black and Brown communities, there's an inherent recognition, a realization, an awakening, as I like to call it, that decision makers are starting to recognize the importance of having folks at the table and not on the table.
Allentza, thank you so much. I cannot wait to dive deeper into our conversation. I'd like to welcome Ishimaru to join us and share a little bit more a little bit more about her work and the work that you all are doing with children and families. So if you can just introduce yourself and tell us, spend about 5 minutes or so, just talking a little bit about your work and your approach to community leadership.
Thank you so much for having me here today. Allentza was beautiful hearing from you, and I'm excited to engage in conversation with you as well. So I'm Ann Ishimaru, and as you heard, I'm at the University of Washington in Seattle on the lands of the Duwamish and other Coast Salish people. And I am a mom of 3 kids. I am an educator, a researcher, and in former professional lives was environmental justice organizer and also a leader of a community-based Asian American arts organization. So I've worn lots of different hats. And I'm also a granddaughter of Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during World War II. And that really has profoundly kind of shaped how I came to this work. Growing up, witnessing the kind of powerful role that my own family played in my education. And then as I became an educator and then a researcher, doing research in family engagement in particular, and also community organizing, and seeing what a disconnect there was between the two of those and the kind of school-based forms of family engagement and the ways in which especially minoritized families were routinely pushed to the side and marginalized, and the ways in which even the activities that were intended to engage families often were the things that alienated and excluded them. And so that was kind of the context for beginning something called the Family Leadership Design Collaborative. And I'm going to share my screen and share some slides just to give you a little bit of context for that. So, it's supposed to be really smooth. So the Family Leadership Design Collaborative today is a national collective of family members, community leaders, educators, and researchers. And we're really focused on how we might cultivate and sustain community well-being and educational justice. And our primary method is through supporting folks in a network that's focused on co-designing with communities, families, and educational systems. And so I always start this by talking about the indigenous people and the land. Because one, we're all on indigenous lands, and I want to acknowledge the histories of violence and resettlement and family separation, but also that the ways in which those things are ongoing as we think about missing and murdered indigenous women, family separation, threats to land and water, and also the disproportionate COVID rates that are happening right now. And in our schools, we have a kind of routine erasure that's happening. But at the same time, we want to honor the knowledge and wisdom and the practices for sovereignty and the cultural and intellectual resources that are the foundation of our project, because that has really been infused in the stances and methods and aims of the work that we've done from the beginning. So in 2015, when we first convened a group of scholars from different disciplinary lines, family and community organizers, we kind of co-designed this vision and started from the point of recognizing that the kinds of activities that I talked about, the parent-teacher meetings, the open houses, all those kinds of things, were not only inadequate, but they kind of put into motion a set of settled white normative expectations and ideas about the purpose of education. And you talk to families, and no family will say, I want my kid to get good test scores, go to college, and escape from my family and community. We're after much broader things around children's well-being, relational, community, and collective approaches to change making, and just institutions and policies. So we have these design principles that evolved. We co-evolved together. And I'm not going to go through each one of them, but this graphic kind of embodies how we think about those different things. And I started with family and community colleges because that is the kind of foundation. And so the network consists of ever expanding networks. We started with 10 sites in our first phase, and we kind of went deep with 4 of them. You see some of them pictured here. Especially Los Angeles, Seattle, Salt Lake City, and Chicago. Those are the ones that were in our second phase, and we're moving into our third phase right now. Really, and I'll talk more about this when we get in our Q&A, focusing on something we call solidarity-driven co-design as a process. And Macy Chin, who's a community organizer in LA, really talks about this as living the future in the present. So I thought it was a really beautiful way of putting that. And Regina, unfortunately, wasn't able to join us today, but she's part of the kind of latest iteration as we think about what we call sister spaces. And so her work, and also I'll refer back to this, some of the work we've been doing recently really amidst what we think of as dual pandemics. So we have the pandemic of COVID, but also the ongoing and not new pandemic of racism, and how we're trying to continue the work and evolve that in new ways in the midst of those dual pandemics.
Thank you so much, Anne. From both you and Allentza, I mean, the thing that's ringing in my mind is co-design and leadership. And so let's jump into a couple of questions. So I'll start with a few questions that I have. I'll invite participants to feel free to drop some questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try and get to those as well. And so for this question, I'd love to hear from both of you. In your work, what does shared governance and decision-making look like? You both alluded to that a bit, and perhaps you could share an example of what that looks like and maybe some key strategies.
Well, maybe I'm happy to get us started.
Yeah,
so for us, we're often working in co-design spaces that are pushing on many of the existing normative practices and structures for decision making. And so that looks very different depending on the context. So one example is the image that I flashed up at the very end there, where we actually co-wrote a piece with families, with parents, about just what it might look like to reimagine education in this moment. And it was, those processes they're longer because we're actually really trying to craft those ideas together, and each of us plays different kinds of roles. But we're often, one of the challenges, even in just trying to get that published in the newspaper, they wouldn't let us list all the people who were part of it. And so the way that it got taken up was very much like Regina and I had written this thing after talking to the parents, but that really wasn't the way that it unfolded. We were all part of that process. And yes, there were places where we were iterating on the product. In this case was this article, but all of them were actually involved from the get-go and through the process. And so I think that it's an example of, in a very kind of micro space, of both how we're trying to do that in ways that are very different, and how even something as simple as trying to get the paper to print it, we run into all kinds of resistance based on the way that the current structures and assumptions are operating.
Yeah, thanks for that, Anne. The challenge that comes to my mind that I think that makes it difficult for people to wrap their head around community co-design are some of these very colonized, very codified systems and structures that a community organic process, like having that space for that organic visioning and growth, just doesn't really mesh well with, I think, is an ongoing challenge. And I think, like, to Anne's example, one of the things that we often find as a challenge is even trying to describe this work to funders. The way we like to present a project is we always talk about a planning and visioning phase with community members to really shape the project. And oftentimes funders want you to come to them with the project already thought out. Like, this is the plan, this is a timeline, this is how it's going to happen. And it just doesn't work that way when you're working in community spaces, because it may take longer than you anticipate to build relationships. And you have to let that process play out the way it needs to play out, because something you may anticipate will take 3 months, which oftentimes, we try to limit our things to like 3 to 6 months for like the visioning. And it actually might take a year because that's how long it's really going to take to do the process of working with community members. And I've literally had funders who have said things to me like, well, this just feels a little too big. Like we can't wrap our heads around this. Like, I don't understand. What do you mean by community? Like that, so the community decides what's going to happen. Like you haven't figured it out and then you bring it to the community. And we're like, no, like we have a framework. We have certainly like a vision for what we think based on the previous engagements we've had with communities. Like here are some ideas for solutions, but it really needs to come from the people to decide what's the best path forward. And we'll work with them as facilitators, as agents to kind of help build out that message for them. But it's not our idea, it's their idea. And I think that's really hard for funders to grasp. And so some of the things that I have done in recent years to kind of help shape this conversation has been to meet with funders ahead of time. And it takes a little bit of work, right? It also means that we now have to plan out a few even extra months earlier in our process, because we have to build in the time to help the funders get on board. And I'll reach out to a funder and say, look, I'm gonna submit this grant application to you. I think I need to talk you through it so that you understand. And if you have a panel of reviewers that you work with, maybe you can then translate this to them. But even that takes a set amount of work. So it's understandable that there may be folks who might be resistant to that, because it's like, wow, that's a lot of work. That's a big process. Now we have to do jump through all these extra hoops just to get the funding in order to get the project off the ground. But in the long run, it's actually worth it, because one, by going through this equitable process, you're building deeper relationships with community, which means you can continue to have these community trust. But two, you're also helping to educate the funder about a different way and about a different practice that funders say they want to lean into, but they just don't really know how.
Exactly. Oh, thank you both so much. Something that you all said that's really resonating with me reminds me of something that we talk about on our team all the time. You can only move at the speed of trust. And that's so important. So my next question for you all, given, of course, the dual pandemics that we're in, but how are you adapting your co-design work within the context of COVID-19? And perhaps if you could start, and then we'll hear from Allentza.
Sure. So you saw in that last image of the last slide where like everything has had to move on to Zoom. And that has provided some new challenges, but also some openings. And so there are, in the case of SPEP and those folks, they had existing relationships they were able to build forward from. But it has meant that, especially some of the partners who are more school-based, it's actually opened up new opportunities to invite families to be part of conversations that they otherwise couldn't get to in one way or another. And so, especially the folks like there's a principal that I've been supporting who in a relatively rural district that's actually predominantly Latino, they don't have a practice of having conversations in Spanish. And he, it's kind of like what Allentza said, he went in without a set agenda. And he got a lot of pushback from the administration and from other folks who were not Spanish speakers. But he just did this one engagement, and 85 families showed up on this electronic call. And so I think that there are enormous constraints at this moment, and there are folks who are figuring out how to navigate those and how to. We identify early on in the project, we have something we identify called aperturas, which is just the Spanish word for opening, but it actually means more than just opening. It's kind of the strategic moment. And I think also a lot about Arundhati Roy's notion of the pandemic portal. And so trying to really think about where are the opportunities to take steps forward and to do things differently than we ever have before, even despite and amidst the many challenges that folks are facing.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. And I would also add, I think the pandemic has really opened up a conversation about access to broadband. that is critically important, not just in this time of the pandemic, but really in this era, which hadn't been really dealt with before. You know, at least from the advocacy side, we've often talked about the lack of broadband access in marginalized communities and the need for that to be addressed quickly. But it wasn't until the pandemic that I think just the disparity, the deep disparity finally came to light. Like, for example, here in the Boston area, we had to distribute 30,000 laptops. Well, not we, but the, you know, the city school district had to distribute 30,000 laptops to students at home because they wouldn't otherwise be able to attend school remotely. And on top of that, there's been ongoing petitioning to Verizon, which is a major broadband service provider here, to offer programs like low-income service programs so that everyone at least still has the opportunity to connect in the face of all these rising costs. And while there's all these new opportunities, like Zoom quickly pivoted during the pandemic and has become, you know, the major platform, but we're also seeing other things like WebEx, like Leaf. It's so funny, like every other day I'm hearing about another web video conferencing tool. But no one would normally have, you know, so many people would not have access to that previously. So the other question is as we are creating these new tools, how are people being trained to be able to adapt and adopt them? And it speaks to a broader gap around the limited amount of coding and design training and coursework that's available to low-income students in historically disadvantaged districts. So it's opened up this whole conversation that I really think that, you know, again, from the organizer side, you know, we've been aware of this, we've been saying this, but I think it became very crystal clear for decision makers who were disconnected that about the vast disparities that have become exacerbated during this time.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a few more of my own questions, but we've gotten a couple questions at our Q&A box, so I will invite folks to continue to share. But our first question, I think, goes back to some of the things we're talking about around shared governance and co-design leadership. It comes from Richard Sussman, and it says, the opportunity for the public to co-design with the professional or government leaders is critically important, but often the welcome to being at the table leads to the need for the public to have some separate time to better understand themselves, their efforts, and their hopes before sitting at the table. How can we best provide this space for their own development? And I saw you nodding, so I'm gonna invite you to take a first stab at that one.
That's a great question. And actually, part of what I want to, I guess, question is this idea of being at the table. So we often, agencies and institutions will create a table that operates a particular way with particular norms and expectations, and then invite other people to join that colonizing table. And so, you know, like I think that's sometimes the tension when we think about governance. We automatically go to the existing structures, the council, the committee, you know, all these kinds of things that have very constrained sets of expectations for how we're going to do the work, the roles we're going to play, the power, and how that's going to play out. And so I think actually in the work that we've done, I've actually identified that it's the folks who are in those roles, who are setting the table and calling the shots. They're the ones who need to have some conversations and capacity building prior to. And the kind of way that Allentza was referring to with regard to funders, because if you just invite a couple of community members or families and you throw everybody at that pre-existing table, we actually know what's going to happen, what's going to unfold. The same dynamics, the same logics are going to play out as we've had before. Even if there are folks at the table who really want to include them, who really want to listen, all of those kinds of things. So we have to actually deconstruct the table in a way, and really go about that a different way, that we've had to do some careful educating and capacity building to prepare folks to be able to engage with families in communities in equitable ways. And that's not to say that families and communities don't also need spaces to develop relationships and understanding and shared critique sometimes of their own experiences. That's also important. But that when you are engaging in co-design, often what we will do is we will begin it, we might do a launch together, but then we'll actually begin it in separate spaces to help folks develop some of those understandings.
Awesome. Thank you. And I see we have a couple more questions coming in, so I'm gonna keep going. But Allentza, perhaps you can take this one. It comes from Joyce Bosco. It says, how do you find institution and others you may want or need in the project to be receptive to the co-designing process and true and authentic partnering? We find that sometimes we need, or they need, an onboarding process and orientation to working this way as well. I think that speaks to some of what Anne was saying, but Allentza would love to hear from you on this one.
Yeah, and I love what you said, Anne, about deconstructing the table, because that's exactly what it's about. It's like, who decides what the table looks like? And if we continue with the metaphor, like, who shapes the table? You know, who's around the table? Who makes decisions about who gets invited? And even if community members are brought to the table, do they feel like they belong? Do they feel like they can relate? And so there's a couple of, the same thing can be applied when thinking about partners. You know, what are the partners' overall goals and objectives? Do their mission and vision align with yours? What is their agenda? You know, we have to be honest that every organization that comes to a table has a political agenda, right? So what is that agenda? And ultimately, does that align with your vision and goals? And if you're not sure, then it's important to have an educational process to get everyone on the same page. And, you know, years ago, I ran a jobs coalition where we were working with local community-based organizations and encouraging them to offer jobs to young people. And at the start of every session, we would do some community building, but we also did a series of orientations. And the orientation really was to ground people around the goals and objectives of the process, what the expectations are. And if there were questions and concerns, we would create space to answer those. But we also made it very clear that we needed all the partners to really be aligned with these goals and expectations. And if they didn't align in any specific way, then it probably wasn't the best role for them to be a partner. And so we would think about other ways that they can support the process. And if they didn't support the process, then they would walk away, and that's okay too. You know, I think it's also okay to say, if this isn't an alignment, then, you know, then they don't have to be at the table, so to speak. But to just create that space to allow for that conversation and that orientation to happen is really important. And I think the same can be said for community members as well. You know, something that we like to do when we're doing community processes, knowing that there are going to be new people at the table every time we get together, we do a pre-shop. We call it a pre-shop, which is a session before the workshop starts. It could be a half hour long, could be even an hour long, to get everyone caught up with what the content is, to create space so that they can ask questions. And also to address some of those underlying differences, because if we're trying to bring diversity to the table, we also need that as well, which also means creating space for affinity groups. It may be a very different conversation for racial and ethnic groups or folks of different socioeconomic backgrounds that they need to just have with each other before coming back together as a large group.
Yeah, and Allentza, I think that's really powerful and ties to another question that's in the chat box from Ilka Walkley. And it says, you know, how have you seen these aha moments where people outside of the community have really come to understand the importance of why community needs to drive this work, and how did you create those aha moments? And I think that speaks to something you were just starting to say about sort of these pre-session or pre-meeting opportunities. But might either of you have anything you want to add to that, creating those aha moments for folks?
Yeah, I would just add that the other, I think, important process of the aha moment, it's a two-way street, right? We do a lot of consulting for government agencies who often will ask us to kind of like you tell them what we want to see happen, as opposed to vice versa. So we also try to do these internal trainings and coaching with our clients, because we're like, at the same time you want us to engage with the community, we need to engage with you too. And we do a lot of racial equity training and cultural efficacy, which is not a term I fully adopted to. I like to say cultural responsiveness, because all cultures evolve and there's no such thing as ever being culturally competent, even in your own culture. But being able to at least be attuned to recognizing the differences in different cultures and being able to be responsive to those needs of the specific identities of your community is really important. So we like to bring those aha moments, so to speak, to our clients, so that they are, so that it doesn't become a transactional exchange with community, but it really becomes like a shared engagement.
Thank you. So, and
Can
I have,
I jump
did you
in?
want to add to
Is that
that?
okay if I jump in there? Yeah.
Yes,
So
please.
one of the things that that has been pretty powerful for us is to, do the kind of pre-work that Allentza was talking about, but also know that no matter how much pre-work we do, those tensions are going to arise. And so when we are with a particular group of folks, we will bring back what scholars call mirror material. So in one case, it was we had kind of like scripted out a dynamic that was really tense in a prior meeting, and we all like knew it was really tense, but we couldn't exactly say what was going on. So we brought back part of that transcript to the next meeting, and we actually separated out by role. So this was a context where we were developing a curriculum, a parent education curriculum. We had a group of parents there, but we also had teachers and principals and district leaders. And we brought that part of the transcript back, and they were in separate role groups. And that was really illuminating because they actually could look at it and say, this is what we're talking about. We just played out the exact same dynamics that we were critiquing about our experiences as parents in schools and how that got racialized. And we were diminished in this interaction with a particular principal who was questioning and putting this one parent on the spot. And what was so interesting is we took that same data, that same transcript, and we showed it to the teachers separately and the principals separately. And the teacher said, wow, there's kind of a power dynamic going on here when you look at the interactions between the principal and the parents. And the principals said, this is a great example of collaboration. This is why we're doing this. So we were all looking at the same thing. And so it was really like this conversation of like, well, okay, well, let's look at it, and kind of digging in, doing the kind of coaching that Allentza was talking about. Do you notice that the principal spoke 40 times during this segment, and 2 of the parents didn't speak at all, and 2 of them spoke 4 times. And so there was a kind of, that was an aha. It was not a comfortable aha. And I had that principal come back later and say, she's like, she didn't react very well in the moment. And she came back and she said, that was my cognitive dissonance of having to reckon with my own practice.
Thank you so much. So we have a few other questions, and these have come through in the chat box. This one comes from Tanya Morellis. It says, related to the at the table conversation, so we might be jumping back a bit here. We often try to create a table where residents will be at the same table with city agencies and city leaders. And I'm just going to jump down to a little bit further in her question. She says, I'm wondering how we can better get the city to buy into our D and reconstructed table. Allentza, might start with that one.
And by the way, hi Tanya. Tanya and I know each other. So I would, it's a tough one, but it goes back to the importance of preparing the agency that's providing the service so that they're more aligned with the same values and they're aware of their own behaviors that stem directly from white supremacist culture, right? And it's a training process that takes both internal and external work happening simultaneously. and they need to be happening in tandem in order for the process to go well. Because like the example that Anne shared, there's several different conversations that are happening. There's one conversation, but within it, there's actually several different conversations because there are multiple interpretations that are taking place. And the same thing can be said for a city staff where they think where, you know, this is a easy, like service on kind of situation, when it's really more of a service at situation, and they're probably not delivering a service that best serves the community. So they have to undergo an orientation and a learning process themselves before before even setting up the table, because it really needs to be a co-design process where the community members should be determining what the table should look like. And that's very hard when you have power dynamics like a city, like government, that's very used to a very power over system and structure.
Thank you, Allentza. And I think that, you know, you talked about what it looks like in those power structures in the city, but we have a question from Stacy Tuck that I think also speaks to other partners. It says, you know, when you first come to the table with community, did you realize that your agency was doing anything that community partners found off-putting? And how did you work through any of those challenges? Perhaps if you have an example. So Anne, might you start us off there?
Sure, for sure. I come out of a university, and universities have a very robust history of doing damage to communities of color, and of weaponizing research against them, of extracting knowledge from them, and all of those things. So when I show up in a space, all of that comes with me, all of that luggage comes with me, all that baggage. And I also work with systems-based leaders who are in schools and districts, and schools also have a very robust history of doing those things. And so some of the, in terms of showing up as a facilitator and trying to do that work, is actually being really transparent and explicit about the histories that I carry with me, both personally, but then also that I represent in a way from the institution. And then we run into that in the nitty gritty all the time. I noticed somebody put something down about stipends and resourcing people. And I have to say, like, that's been a really big challenge, not because we aren't trying to get folks resourced, but because I work in an incredibly complex bureaucracy that makes that very difficult sometimes, when I routinely am, you know, trying to ensure that my partners and the families are getting resources for doing this work, but they have to navigate very complex bureaucracy on my end institutionally in order to get those resources. So that's a kind of concrete, nitty-gritty logistical dynamic that is shaped by these much broader historical and ongoing dynamics that come out of the institution that I'm with.
Oh, go ahead, Allentza. Please jump in.
Yeah, I would just add that, you know, that mistakes are always going to be made, and we shouldn't be afraid of them. We just need to make sure that we're honest and transparent and acknowledge them so that we can pivot immediately, right? Because we're all born and raised within the confines of these inequitable systems. So we're bound to replicate them even in our practice, even when we're trying to unend that practice, right? So my organization, myself, you know, we've been guilty of replicating, you know, behaviors. And then when we recognize them and community members will call us out, we say, okay, thank you for telling us, we're gonna pivot and change. And it's just a matter of embracing that and not being afraid to receive that constructive criticism and being able to adjust as needed. I can tell you a very brief example. We were doing a community workshop around planning and design terms because the city that we were working with was doing a planning process in a community that they historically had very poor relationships with. So we came in and we said, okay, we'll work with the community members and we'll do some neighborhood workshops so that the community members have the tools to engage in the conversation. We found local partners we built these relationships, and things were going great. And then we had the workshop itself, and we kept using acronyms, like these very like deep planner lingo acronyms, like I forget the the whole conversation itself, but at one point I said something like, I kept saying TOD, which stands for transit oriented development, and a community member said, "Who's this Todd that you keep talking about? Who's Todd? Like, what is this? I don't understand." And it was a good catch, because I was like, at the same time when we're trying to address these like barriers, there was a language justice issue that we hadn't caught ourselves up in. So we immediately pivoted and said, okay, for the following session, we're going to do, and we gamified it, right? We turned it into a Jeopardy game where we then broke down all of these terms and turned it into a game. But it's just recognizing that, we're part of these systems that are oppressive, and our work to undo that oppression, we also need to be open to checking ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I have a couple more questions, and I'm hoping we can get to a couple of them. This one comes from Jamie Metzger. It says, it seems inequitable that community members aren't being paid for their time when project managers and other higher-ups are, and asking for funding to pay community consultants often leads to limitations on who gets to be at the table. Funders will pay for one consultant and need them to be a leader or something. What are your thoughts on this? And could you start us off there?
This is an issue all of the time in the work that we do, and I think it's not so much that kind of the consultancy context that we're in, but thinking about like schools and school systems and how they decide they can allocate resources and for whom. And so sometimes that really means, on the side of the shifting the structures and systems on the part of districts in this case, there has to be a lot of work to make sure that some of those things are possible, not just in terms of bureaucracy, but one of the examples was that we had, families who came out of refugee camps, parents, and they were powerful parent leaders. And the district had policies put in place that if you didn't have your GED or high school diploma, that you couldn't get paid in a particular category. And so, that was one of the things that the project took on, and one of the district leaders said, you know what, we're going to have to really shift this. We're going to have to change the policy, because this is coming up now. It's going to continue to come up. And if we are serious about valuing the expertise in our families and communities, then we need to actually change how we operationalize those kinds of ways to resource people.
Agreed. So we make it a point to pay community members that we engage as much as possible. For example, with our gentrification mapping project, we banked stipends to cover community members' time. And recently, my organization launched a mini grants program for artists of color who have been impacted by the pandemic. And there are a lot of really great programs out there that emergency funds that have popped up since the pandemic happened. But one of the things that we recognized was that even access to that was limited, especially for community members who don't have insurance, for those who are undocumented. So we started offering a lot of alternative ways to fund, to provide these gifts, including paying people through Venmo, through PayPal, sending checks, and in a few cases just mailing cash, because we had to be expansive in order to really support those who were most marginalized and most at risk. At the same vein, we have learned to overbill. We just put it into our line item when we are putting in, preparing scopes for our consulting projects, because more often than not, government agencies do not plan to fund any kind of stipends or gifts to community members, even though there's an expectation of community engagement. So we just put that in, and to make sure that it's covered. It's usually not always a lot, and we usually get a lot of pushback, but we then have to make the case that if this is not something that you can support, then this isn't the right project for us.
Allentza, that it's so important. It's so important to figure out how to build it in and how to compensate people for their time and the energy that we're asking them to put in. So I have a couple more questions. I'm going to do my best to get to them. This one question is comes from Caroline. It says, would you suggest that if there are major agencies that are in the area that do not align with the goals and the vision of the project or community, to go to smaller, maybe even new agency to begin building capacity from scratch? So thinking about perhaps partners, if they're not in alignment, how might you suggest working with them?
You go first, Anne. I'm going to marinate a bit.
Well, for in the work that we do, it's often community-based organizations, researchers and institutions, and then like schools and districts. So maybe the scope isn't quite as broad for us. But I will say that one of the things that tends to happen in any kind of system is that when folks think about undertaking co-design and getting more robust community engagement, there's often a kind of reversion to like, we have to do this everywhere, in all places, in everything, all at once. And so I often try to counsel folks, like part of this is developing a kind of muscle organizationally, and you have to develop some new practices. And in order to do that, you can't sort of like just offer a broad scale training and say, okay, everybody now do this. You actually have to build the capacity to do it by doing it. So by starting with a particular project, and we think about it as sort of growing, like rippling out the work, that we can talk about, there's a lot of talk about how we scale these kinds of things, and there's some underlying theories of change that have to do with a kind of top-down way of scaling, and we really kind of try to think about how do you build the capacity of people to do the work by doing the work, and then we grow that out from there.
Thank you, Allentza. I'll let you have the last word. I think this might be on this question, if you have anything to add. Otherwise, I can maybe squeeze in one more question.
Yeah, so I feel like the question is really fundamental to equity principles. And one of the principles that we work by are the 4 I's. And I don't know if everyone's familiar with that, so I'll try to quickly summarize. But the 4 I's is really a concept that allows us to look at the various dimensions in which equity needs to be addressed. Starting with the individual, which is us as individual people, and then our social networks, the people around us who influence us, our environments that shape our ideas, and how we engage with others in the world. And then the institutions, which are the organizations and agencies that really uphold these systems, be it systems of oppression or otherwise. And oftentimes when we talk about equity, we tend to think about it only within the framework of institutions, but there's actually a 4th dimension, which is the ideological space. This is where the ideas, the foundational premise of supremacy that continues to permeate and shape how these institutions are structured, these ideas that are then passed on to our social networks and our interpersonal relationships, and then absorbed internally by us as individuals. And it's a cyclical cycle, right? Where these ideas continue to feed into another. So co-design is also about disruption. It's like disrupting the way these normative practices are and the way they take place. And we also have to think about that from an ideological space too. Like, where are these ideas that are coming from? How are they constantly being reinforced? And what are the institutions that continue to uphold these ideas that then end up shaping our how we engage and interact with others, and then how we see ourselves in the world. And I think it's important to think about that as we think about, like, what are the roles that different ideas the role that different ideas around change can shape an institution. And I think, like Ann said, it is about exercising that muscle, but it's not just about large institutions, it's institutions of any size that really needs to look at how to shape this muscle, because it needs to be a collective effort that continues to cycle through those 4 dimensions that I talked about. And there's a lot more to be said about that, but of course we don't have a lot of time, but there's, I think the sharing of, in the chat box of the 4 eyes, because I think it's a really good, useful way to help us think about how processes are perpetuated, including oppressive processes.
Well, one, I know, thank you, Allentza, thank you, Anne. I know there are a couple of questions that we didn't get to in the chat box, but I am hoping that we might invite participants to visit us at the Now Innovation Forum and keep the conversation going, and sharing some additional questions and ideas. There were questions around what can state agencies do to lead this kind of work? How can they begin to build their capacity? So I'd love for us to perhaps continue that conversation on the Now Innovation Forum as we are running out of time today. But really, Allentza and Anne, thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us, to share your experiences, your wisdom and knowledge, and to help us think more deeply about deconstructing these tables, decolonizing the process of community engagement, and really creating authentic, meaningful pathways for community leadership. So in the spirit of continuing to stay connected to us, I'd like to just share some opportunities to connect with leaders across the country on some special topics over the coming year. The Networks of Opportunity for Child Wellbeing is beginning peer learning clusters. We're building a national network. It's really focused on building capacity and leveraging the collective wisdom that you all have from across the country, and coming up with some implementation strategies that you can try in your own community. And so in the chat box, we just dropped a link to where you can fill out an interest form to learn a little bit more about that work. Our first peer learning cluster to kick off will focus on the early education workforce development in early care and education. And so again, would love for you all to take a moment, if you're interested in being a part of those conversations, to join us there. And with that, to our participants, thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to hearing from you soon. Please follow us on Twitter at @now_wellchild or @vital_village. Allentza and Anne, thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing everybody soon. Have a great day. Take care of yourselves.
Thank you all.
So much.